In today's labor news, we'll stay here at home. AT&T is in contract negotiations with the CWA, the Communication Workers of America, who represent over 100,000 workers. And the CWA has authorized a strike if negotiations don't go through. And if you Google this story, you'll find something I've said again and again, and that is that labor issues, when they are followed in the mainstream media, are typically framed from a consumer standpoint. That is, you will see the basic facts of this story, and there will be some reassurance that services will not be cut. Instead, the media could let you know what the CWA is fighting for. It is fighting for AT&T to shoulder the increased burden of healthcare costs. AT&T, which benefited from $13 billion profit last year, could certainly shoulder the burden. Not only is it asking for AT&T to shoulder this burden, it is asking for AT&T to push forward for real healthcare reform in this country, which is the only thing that is going to stop this ridiculous runaway healthcare costs that we have in this country, where the number one reason why Americans file for bankruptcy is healthcare costs. 1 in 3 Americans either doesn't have healthcare insurance, or their insurance is so expensive they can't possibly use it. We need reform in this country. The CWA is fighting for that, not only through their employer, but they're asking their employer to push this forward on the national agenda. Certainly, if this was covered in a worker point of view, most workers in this country could certainly sympathize and support what the CWA is fighting for. As usual, there'll be links in the sidebar. In other news, there's an interesting story in the New York Times today by Stephen Greenhouse, and it's entitled, "In America, Labor Has an Unusually Long History." And I'll just start out with a quote from it. American labor leaders, once up from the street rabble-rousers, now often work hand-in-hand with CEOs to improve corporate competitiveness, to protect jobs and pensions, and try to sideline activists who support a hard line. Very interesting. Now, what the article is getting at is we've all seen the increased militancy across Europe, in France, Germany, in Italy, in Ireland, workers doing everything from kidnapping bosses to occupying factories, and yet here in the United States, we see very little action going on, despite mass layoffs, workers not getting paid, run the gamut of problems the American worker is facing. Unemployment is at an all-time high, wages are down, and yet where's the militancy? Aside from a few isolated protests, a couple, small actions. But it's very telling in this article that Stephen Greenhouse points out that the American labor leaders try to sideline activists who support a hard line. I mean, basically he points out that American labor leaders have, by and large, been co-opted by big business, and this is a fact of life. There's a partnership between the building trades and the contractors. It goes on and on throughout the different unions. There is a real reason. I mean, one of the reasons that there's less militancy, there's a lot of reasons. One, we're not as class conscious. 2, our labor history has probably been more violent than anything ever seen in Europe, and I'm sure it's some level that's in our minds as activists, because we remember how violent it can be. But also, much of our labor leadership has been co-opted by power, by corporate America, and is subservient. And when we step out of line, not only does corporate America smack us on the head, but oftentimes our labor leadership. And so pursuing real grassroots action is not very easy in this country. Not impossible. Moving on to another story, we're asking you to tell Rite Aid to stop its union busting. The federal government was preparing to charge Rite Aid with 49 labor law violations, but the company got off with a slap on the wrist. After workers prevailed and voted joining an international longshore and warehouse union last March, Rite Aid continued the attacks, and now the company is refusing to sign a first contract and has hired an anti-union busting company to figure out how to decertify the process. the situation at Rite Aid is a perfect example why we need EFCA, the Employee Free Choice Act. It's more important now than ever. And that brings me to our next story, which is a blog post entitled "Mobilizing with Pots and Pans to Reverse the Bloodless Coup." And essentially, one of the main problems with passing EFCA is the filibuster. It's a practice in Senate. I think most of us have heard of it. Typically, it's supposed to be, if a senator really doesn't want something to pass, he has to just blab and blab and blab, to avoid any kind of vote on the matter. But in modern rules, the Roberts Rules of Procedure and Senate Rule 11, it enables a very small number of senators to defend the status quo, to prevent change, and to prevent enactment of bills or the appointment of judges and officials. Filibustering, like I said, used to involve unlimited talking or debate, but under modern usage, no senator speaks endlessly. A single senator privately and secretly informs his party leader that he objects to the proposal. The party leader honors his wish and requires all members of the party to vote against ending debate. Then no vote on the merits can be had until a supermajority of 60 senators vote to permit a vote. This is what's happening with EFCA now. And it's anti-democratic. It needs to stop. And it's something we as activists need to start considering, because oftentimes, we fight for these things and we just ignore the rules. We ignore the rules in voting, how people get on ballots, and we ignore these simple rules like the filibuster to our detriment. And lastly, just to celebrate the wonders of capitalism, I just want to say a few words about hedge fund managers. There's a story, it's called Down But Not Out at $464 million a year. Hedge fund managers are raking in an average of $464 million a year during this economic crisis. If you don't know what a hedge fund does, it's fascinating. A hedge fund buys and sells things at the exact same moment, within a nanosecond. And the best hedge funds rely on supercomputers that can do these crazy calculations. They get these brains from MIT to figure out these formulas, and they search the different markets and find fluctuations in price and instantly buy and sell. And it's of no value to anybody. And yet, these people are making $464 million a year. Ah, the joys of capitalism. That's your labor news today, and I hope you'll get active. I hope you'll organize, educate, and agitate. Peace.